So, February 22nd, 2026, the BAFTAs, the British Oscars basically, managed to ignite a very serious conversation about racism and ableism. See, when Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo went up to present at the 2026 BAFTAs, in a pause, the N-word is heard loudly across the auditorium. Honestly, it's difficult to watch, especially when Delroy Lindo clocks it. All these gentlemen set out to do was to present an award on what should have been a really magical night, and they were exposed to an abusive slur used by white oppressors throughout history. Naturally, people are upset about this. I don't really have any skin in the game here. I myself am white. I can't truly empathize with the feeling of a word carrying that kind of historical weight, but I can see how it makes black people feel, and I know I wouldn't want to feel like that. Where it gets complicated, though, is that the person who shouted the N-word was John Davidson. John Davidson is a Tourette's activist who has, himself, Tourette's with Coprolalia. This means not only does he have the involuntary tics that come with Tourette's, but that the content reflects culturally learned taboo and not his own personal beliefs. It is also very common for these to occur in the absolute worst circumstances, which I think is exactly what happened. And unless you are completely isolated from society, you have at some stage perceived the N-word. And it's pretty universally understood that this is probably the most volatile word in the English language. Given that tics are taboo, this is why this happened, and the recognized severity of the N-word is why that slur of all slurs was the one said. Tics can only sometimes, with luck, be stifled, like a sneeze. The tragedy is that people with coprolalia are often the greatest victim of their own tics. With this can very often come suicidal ideation and attempts, due to the intense embarrassment, social isolation, stigmatization, all of which are recognized factors in increasing the risk of suicide. John Davidson, as an example, has attempted to take his own life in the past. So it is very important that people be mindful of their reactions to this. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. There has been a lot of bad faith surrounding this. There's the, oh, it's just a word, don't be so sensitive crowd. And then there's the, oh, I'm sorry, I thought disabled people were supposed to be adorable and charming crowd. Now, you might be wondering, why are you making this video? You're not black, you don't have Tourette's. And this is correct. But I also just really want to kind of talk to the folks in the room who, like myself, have a tendency to speak on matters that they don't really have anything to do with, because we're impulsive and have egos. Please don't actively ask black people to be okay with this purely on the basis of intent. We don't have the right to do that. We don't have the right to place judgments on what we can't comprehend due to a lack of lived experience. I can't ask people from a demographic I don't belong to react a certain way. I mean, for God's sake, Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo literally only went up to present an award. They did not deserve to be exposed to that, and I applaud them for their composure in the moment. The same also goes for disabled people. You cannot ask a disabled person to just not show up because it's an inconvenience, or to just go to another room. That is segregation for something someone cannot help, and we all know better. You also can't ask a person with Tourette's to stifle their tics. They cannot reliably, physically do that. There is, however, a separate conversation about apologies. Should John Davidson apologize as a white man? And I've heard some interesting points. I think Tom Harries made a completely valid point that if someone with Tourette's is expected to apologize for their tics, are we basically asking them to apologize for who they are on a neurological level? Well, since the incident, John Davidson has released a statement, and I must admit, I don't think it's very good. It's very clearly soon after the fact, so hopefully there's something a little better to come later, maybe. I'll put it on screen, but to me, it comes off like he's oblivious to the impact of that particular tic, or like he doesn't even realize. The statement feels insular and a little insensitive, and I guess I can't blame someone who has lived with this condition for that, but that is just how it's coming across. Intent and impact don't always align, and that's becoming a theme. So should he apologize? I personally think it would be the graceful thing, and my reason for this is by no means one-to-one comparable, but I want to bring up bipolar and apologies. Not because it's a perfect comparison, but because it's an instance where it's generally understood that apologies are owed even for things that the person can't necessarily control. As I say, it's not the exact same because coprolalia tics are completely involuntary, while bipolar disorder is an impairment, but it's the closest I can think to right now that gets my point across. I've, in the past, when I was much younger, lived with people with bipolar disorder for an extensive time. I've grown up around them. And I've had experiences where the intensity of the other person's bipolar can exhibit behaviors that can overlap with or be interpreted as emotional and verbal abuse, when in very particularly intense bouts. So while I was effectively experiencing verbal abuse in that instant, for example, the other person wasn't necessarily an abusive person. The way they were treating me in that moment didn't reflect their actual opinions of me, but it still hurt. And I still feel I am owed an apology for the impact. So while I think it's too much to ask someone with coprolalia to apologize for their tics, I think if the tic comes out as something as deeply hurtful as that, an apology is still warranted purely just for the impact. Whether or not John Davidson is racist, Delroy Lindo, Michael B. Jordan, and every black person in attendance and viewing experienced racism, and I think an apology is warranted just for that. Another thing that people do need to be aware of is that forgiveness is also a personal decision, even if it can seem a little unreasonable, dependent on perspective. Nobody is obligated to continue interacting with someone or their work after any kind of transgression, intentional or not. The same goes for disabled people who have witnessed the ableism that has materialized in response. If you're one of the people who took this as an opportunity to be ableist, your disabled friends are not obligated to forgive you for that, even if you are genuinely sorry, or even if you couldn't help it for whatever reason. Where it becomes a different thing is when the denial of forgiveness becomes harassment. The decision to not forgive does not justify continued attacks if everything has been accounted for. I can tell you now, there is one entity that I don't personally believe deserves any forgiveness, and that is the BBC. This wasn't a live broadcast, and it was delayed by 2 hours. The reason given for which was to avoid anything politically charged or provocative in speeches. This included removing Free Palestine from Akinola Davis's acceptance speech. The BBC have come under fire for editing statements supporting Palestine out of their Glastonbury Festival coverage, and yet they'll allow dozens of their viewers at home to be blindsided by the N-word with no statement prior or after, or censorship. The BBC needs to rethink their approach to impartiality if they're willing to edit out anything pertaining to causes, but not the N-word. They have a duty of care to protect the people they're broadcasting, as well as the viewers from discrimination, and I do not feel that they've adequately fulfilled that. Because of this, everything is far bigger than it would have been had the matter been dealt with privately. Also, if you see someone with a blue check mark saying the most inflammatory thing possible or trying to exacerbate the situation, I don't want to say ignore them, but by responding to them, you might as well be putting money in their pockets. It's better to let them bleed out. Finishing up, all I'm trying to do here is lay out what we universally shouldn't do. Disability as a context doesn't excuse racism. Racism as a context doesn't excuse ableism. We can accept that these are two universal truths. Racism and ableism are both deeply societally unacceptable. If you're a white person who has asked your black friends to suck it up, please apologize to them. If you're not disabled and you've ever implied that a disabled person should be ostracized because of a disability that they'd 100% rather be without, please apologize to them. It is the right thing to do. And for where I myself have stepped out of line and spoken uninformed and downplayed things that I don't understand, I'm sorry.